Dead Space is back, and a remake of the first entry in the franchise has come out this year. With no hesitation, I can tell you it is a truly fantastic remake and game in its own right. Dead Space is a franchise that I only discovered sorta late, some 5 years or so after the release of the last game, Dead Space 3, but I can say it was instantly one of my favorites right off the bat. Having little knowledge about it, discovering the first Dead Space was one of those experiences you never forget. It had everything I love and more. It's a perfect, immersive horror experience with a premise that feels original, but also harkens back to other beloved horror properties like John Carpenter's The Thing or Alien. The combat and gameplay is reminiscent of Resident Evil 4, but the concept of severing off limbs to defeat your enemies instead of just blowing them away create a unique horror survival experience. You have the futuristic space sci-fi setting with compelling characters and lore, and the list goes on and on. So that raises the question, why remake this? When the announcement was made that the Dead Space franchise had been resurrected with a remake of the first game, I didn't really know how to feel. Honestly, as is most often the case, I'd rather just see a new entry into the series that continues the story. The original got so much right, and still looks and plays great, that my initial reaction to the news was just, why? I just wasn't feeling it, and honestly, wasn't expecting much. But now that the game is out, and it is in fact good, I wanted to just take a look at the new game and the original, and basically just look at what went right, and see if my initial feelings towards the announcement of the game were warranted or not. Of course, there will be spoilers for the original Dead Space and in the remake, so be warned. And also note that any sort of minor criticisms or complaints I have may sound like nitpicking, and they pretty much are. I adore both games tremendously, and I'm only trying to break down both and what makes them as good as they are. I don't often get that excited by the news of a remake. Both in games and video games, a remake rarely comes along that feels warranted to me, really. There should be a pretty good reason why a whole amount of effort is going to be put into making something that technically already exists. And in a world with an abundant amount of entertainment in both mediums, I as a viewer or player should have a good reason to invest my time in something I already have before. But alas, it doesn't always feel that way. Movies, I think, are more guilty of this than video games. They can often just feel like a cash grab that's leveraging off a title that people are familiar with. They can feel especially unfair when it's leveraging off somebody else's work. But that doesn't say all remakes are bad and aren't warranted, of course. A good remake usually works because there's room for improvement in some way, or the story can be told in a different way, or the context in which it was made has dated the product negatively in some way. I may be overgeneralizing, but it seems to me that in the world of video games, as technology gets better, people seem to be less inclined to go back and play older games. I've heard people say things like, this game feels dated, or this didn't age well. I can't speak for younger gamers, but I imagine this is because it's just more exciting and enticing to play something brand new, which I guess I do understand. After all, when I was a kid playing Super Nintendo and Nintendo 64 games, I rarely found myself going back and playing the original NES games. Now that I'm older, I do enjoy playing older games, not only for nostalgia reasons, but I also enjoy seeing a project or a work of art made from people living in a different time period using different technology. But regardless, we now seem to be living in a time of video game remakes. Current-gen consoles and PC technology have pushed the bounds of realism to the point where some games look so real and can feel just as cinematic as a live-action movie, and it's hard to imagine how much better that technology can get from there. Realism is a huge part of what draws a player into very grounded and story-driven titles, and this is most certainly true for horror titles, which is why they seem to be the ones that need remakes the most. The recent success of Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes have had a large hand in pushing this idea, and along with Dead Space and titles like Silent Hill 2 and The Last of Us, I guess it's inevitable that remakes are going to happen, for good or bad. Which brings us to Dead Space. Developed by Motive Studio this time around as opposed to Visceral Games, the game comes 15 years after the release of the original, which is indeed quite a long time. In case you aren't aware, the story of both versions revolve around a rescue mission to the Planet Cracker mining ship, USG Ishimura, which is performing an illegal mining operation on the planet Aegis 7 in the distant year of 2508. Once there, our main protagonist Isaac Clarke and the rest of the crew board the ship to discover that something has wiped out almost all the entire crew of the Ishimura, that something being a horde of virus-like organisms called necromorphs. In the remake, the game starts off almost exactly like the original. We see the last message of Isaac's girlfriend, Nicole Brennan, before zooming out to the interior of the rescue ship Kellion, as we meet Isaac, the engineer, and the other members of the rescue team. This beginning is a good indicator as to the remake as a whole, and how true it is to the original. The entire game plays out almost exactly the same, with just the right amount of alterations and improvements, which I think comes out of the Resident Evil 1 playbook. So if the game is so true to the original, what changes were made to justify an entire remake? The biggest changes you'll find in the game are, obviously, the graphics, Isaac speaks, the free-floating in zero-G that was introduced in Dead Space 2, new alterations to the weapons, new side quests, and a new access system which opens up new areas that add a new backtracking element, and a slew of other minor ones. Let's start with the obvious one, graphics. As I stated before, I think the original Dead Space still looks great to this day. The whole game takes place on a giant spaceship, which I think gave the original a big advantage. The environments are all dark gray metallic interiors, which leaves the smaller details easier to hide, I guess. Even Isaac's outfit is completely metallic. You don't see his head the majority of the game, although humans don't necessarily look bad or anything. But even so, the new game is obviously an improvement. Maybe not so much a jump in quality that I was completely blown away, like, say, playing Resident Evil Remake after playing the original of that game. Even after arriving to the franchise late, I was never taken out of the original game, due to unrealistic graphics or even acting for that matter. Which is part of why I'm most hesitant about a game remake, when the original is beautifully designed and has as much character as the original Dead Space has. Of course, there is room for improvement, and the remake looks absolutely stunning. But I just worry about if there can ever be complete satisfaction in the look of a game, or will game visuals be nitpicked to death and never be quite good enough? Can a game even look absolutely perfect? Or should we just be able to accept a game for what it is, and when it was made? Who's to say? But regardless, as much as the original looks as good as it does, there were enough improvements to the look of the game to justify them. The one thing I noticed is that it is definitely a darker game. So much so I feel like various necromorphs were sometimes harder to see and took me by surprise way more often than the original. This is usually a good thing, but sometimes I found it a bit irritating. Of course, I appreciate the realistic horror of something jumping in and out of the shadows and not being 100% aware of where they are. But I'd be completely lying if I didn't say I didn't get slightly more frustrated in certain parts, in which I was blindsided by an enemy with no way of avoiding it. But at the same time, this can be part of the fun and challenge of the game. I do think it also made it a little bit harder, though, to get a look at the necromorphs themselves. I could tell you exactly how a necromorph looked when it was staring me down in the hallway in the original, but in the new one, I could sometimes only see a giant blobby mess of flesh, which is a shame because, unsurprisingly, the design of the creatures is amazing. I may be imagining it, but they also seem quieter in their movements, making it easier to come up behind you without being detected. Also, I give big props to the game for retaining a very similar UI design, as well as an overall aesthetic similarity to the original. That, mixed with another great soundtrack and sound design, keeps the game feeling much like the original. Why fix what isn't broken? One big aspect of the original Dead Space that differs from the other games is that Isaac is a silent protagonist, akin to Link in the Zelda games, whereas the two sequels had Isaac speaking. I don't have any strong feelings one way or the other in regards to this, really. I enjoyed the original's feeling of being a little extra immersed in the unfolding of events, since you kind of feel like you're Isaac, with everyone directing their actions and dialogue at essentially you as the player. But I also enjoyed how they changed it up in the two sequels by making Isaac speak, especially his characterization in Dead Space 2, as a man suffering mentally from the horrific events of the first game. The actor Gunnar Wright returns to voice Isaac in the remake, and this always seemed like the best move to me. Not only does it make it more cohesive with Dead Space 2 and 3, but it adds an interesting new perspective from Isaac, where you can actually hear him react to the events of the game, which is also his first exposure to all the madness of the story of Dead Space. It's also fun to hear Isaac hash it out with Hammond and Kendra on how to solve the various problems they run into and how they're going to get off the Ishimura. If anything, maybe it takes the tension away a little bit, since Isaac is now speaking for you, so there's less left up to the imagination as to how this character would be reacting in the scenario. But either way, it works incredibly well. Gameplay is really much the same, with a slight variation on the controls, such as pressing down the left stick to run instead of holding down A to run. But outside of that, not much else to note as far as the main control scheme. Even running on a different engine, it still feels exactly like the original. And in true good horror game fashion, in which you have just enough freedom of movement in your actions to defend yourself, but not so much that you feel overpowered or unrealistically immobile. All the abilities make a return, like Kinesis and the Stasis module, and they work basically the same as the original as far as I can tell. You of course kill enemies the same way by severing off their limbs. There is a new layer system implemented in which you can strip off layers of skin, giving more of a visual of how much damage you've done to them. One major change, as mentioned before, are the zero gravity segments, as now you're free floating instead of the originals being sort of stuck to one surface with the option to jump to any other flat surface. This was introduced in Dead Space 2 as a preferable replacement to the old zero-G concept, and is an obvious change to make, but I must admit, I never actually hated the original concept. Jumping from wall to wall was kind of fun to me personally, because it created a sort of puzzle-like way of having to navigate these parts of the game. But the free-floating concept really just makes more sense, and is also just more fun. So again, I can go either way, but not a surprise change. It does, however, change up two of the boss fights and how they play out, particularly the second Leviathan Remnant fight, which is almost completely overhauled from a simple pointing and shooting a giant cannon to a more involved segment of accessing different cannons in zero-G on the outside of the ship, while also avoiding a lot of dangerous attacks from the Leviathan. This is definitely a welcome change, and I think it offers a bit more of a challenge. As far as weapons go, they mostly play the same, but most of them have had their secondary functions tweaked a bit or changed completely. The pulse rifle now shoots an explosive mine like in Dead Space 2, unlike the original's 360 burst function. The Ripper's blades can now ricochet around, causing more damage in the area. The flamethrower now creates a giant wall of fire. The line gun now makes laser traps instead of explosive ones. The contact beam's original primary function is now its secondary, with its new primary being one continuous beam. And last but certainly not least is the force gun, which now has this insane gravity well as its second function, which pulls enemies into a single spot, making it great for taking out many enemies at once. I think I ultimately prefer these new secondary functions to the original, so I don't think I use the originals as much, and with a tweaked weapon bench upgrade system, there's even more to upgrading your weapons now. Certain upgrade notches have to be found and brought to the bench over the course of the game, so don't plan on maxing out one weapon at the very beginning. Plus, the secondary fire can be improved as well. You can also now carry all your weapons at once, which makes a huge difference. You can still only equip 4 at a time, but you can open your inventory and change out which weapons you want to equip anytime. In the original game, much of your quest could feel a bit linear. You're given an objective in one area of the ship, you take the tram to that part of the ship, and you do what needs to be done in that area. You revisit some parts, but it's still sort of formulaic. In this remake, there is some new side missions, including one regarding Nicole Brennan and what she experienced in the events leading up to Isaac's arrival. This, plus a new security clearance gimmick, which progressively gets you into more and more previously locked areas, all gives you more reason to do some backtracking. You can now use the tram system more freely, and there's also some alternate routes added. There are a few areas in the game that have been either retooled or completely cut, but there's nothing really that major done that will truly disappoint any fan of the original. This game retains a lot of the same story beats and lore, so much that you could probably play me an audio clip from either game and I wouldn't be able to tell you which version it was from. I haven't done a super deep dive yet, but I would guess that most of the visual and written recordings you find are almost identical to the original. And now with these new side quests, you get even more insight into the events of the game. Not to mention the extra dialogue from Isaac, now that he can speak, adds a little more context. There's even a little extra backstory to Isaac himself, and even has a new tie to the Church of Unitology. There's also a new bonus ending when replaying the new game plus. Some other minor changes include a new circuit breaker system, in which power can only be routed to one door or function at a time. Some fancy holograms here and there. A couple more Dead Space 2 features, like using kinesis on parts from dismembered necromorphs to throw at other enemies, as well as being able to smash corpses after defeat in order to get their items. There's now an actual button command for refilling your stasis on the fly. Some areas have parts of the Leviathan growth blocking certain areas in which you need to shoot its weak spot to get rid of it. One weird change, I thought, was the malfunctioning gravity wells you sometimes find in the floor. In the original, these wells shoot any subject unfortunate enough to stumble upon them into the ceiling, killing them instantly. Whereas in the remake, they are changed to just a shock-inducing hazard. I don't know why this change was made. I always loved luring the bad guys into these parts and watching them shoot up and explode. I don't really see a reason to change it, but oh well. Also, fuck these little assholes. I hate them in the original, and now they're even more aggressive and hard to avoid now, but luckily they seem to be even more scarce than the original, so it all works out. There may be even more changes I missed, but those are all the more obvious ones you're likely to notice between the two games. Alright, so that's a good amount of changes, and all for the better it would seem. It does feel like quite a good amount to warrant remaking a whole new game to implement them, and as I mentioned, I do believe the game is amazing overall, so it was definitely worth remaking this entire game? Well, of course, no remake is absolutely necessary, but in the case of this remake, I have to say I'm still on the fence a little bit as to whether this game needed to be made. I think there's still a couple of reasons that this remake didn't necessarily need to happen, and it still keeps me hesitant to accept that a remake always needs to happen in order to still appreciate the franchise or be introduced to it. I want to break down my reasoning now, but I do want to say in advance that I don't mean for this to be one massive complaint section. I do love this remake and greatly appreciate all the love and hard work that the developers put into the game. This is more for me to process why this sort of thing is done and should it be done and what it means for remakes going forward, as well as what it means for the video game industry as a whole. First of all, I still don't feel like the original Dead Space is that dated, at least not to the point where it is unplayable. Maybe I'm out of touch with new players, but speaking as someone who did technically arrive late to the franchise while playing the next-gen console, I never felt like I was playing an old game, and I still don't really. I can still play the original and get lost in the game without noticing the outdated aspects of it. And even when I do, it's not really enough to turn me off the game. As I stated before, I do like playing older games and experiencing the context in which they were made, but I get that not everybody does. Everyone reacts to things differently and have certain standards that need to be met in order to devote their time to playing something. I don't know if it's a social thing, like only wanting to play something new and relevant that your friends may be playing, or that the rest of the video game community is playing and talking about, or maybe it's all just psychological, which I get. There is something very satisfying about buying something brand new that also shows off the latest hardware capabilities of the time. I would only suggest trying to accept that some things, whether they're movies or video games, are just going to be of their time, and that's not really a bad thing. Yet there are some games that are very noticeably old and harder to play. I'm going to talk about it more in my next video, but the remake of the first Resident Evil game, in a lot of ways, became the definitive way to experience that game. But if they had never made it, would that have changed anything? Would it negatively affect my enjoyment of the franchise as a whole in some big way? Could I still play the original and enjoy it enough? That answer is best for another video someday. In the case of Dead Space, I asked the same. And I have to say, as great as it is, if they hadn't made this remake, I don't think much would be different. My feelings before its release are sort of the same as now. Even with how good it turned out, standing back and looking at the two games, it's easy to say that surely this remake is now the new definitive version of Dead Space. But if someone wants to jump into the Dead Space franchise for the first time, and they ask me if they should play the original or the remake first, I honestly think I could go either way. This might be due to a few things that the original game has that the remake doesn't, which I think has its place in the franchise. Most notably things like the silent protagonist, the alternate zero-G gameplay, and honestly even the more primitive graphics give it a certain charm that really encapsulates the games that were made at that time. I don't think any of these aspects of the original game are so bad that it makes it unplayable. I only say this because I worry about certain franchises that I like always going to feel the need to reboot or remake certain games in order to relaunch a franchise or bring in new players. I don't understand the need to constantly overdo the relaunch of a franchise because there's thought to be a need to sort of re-wrangle people into being interested in their property, as if people have forgotten why that property is good, or they're incapable of going back to the beginning in order to be brought up to speed. Maybe the numbers back this reasoning, but it just seems excessive to me. Which leads me to another question as to the intentions of this remake. Are they trying to relaunch the Dead Space franchise and eventually make Dead Space 4? And if they are they going to remake Dead Space 2 and 3 before we can even get a Dead Space 4? Why is there always the need to go over the top and relaunching the previous games for your remakes in order to move forward, if that is the case? Again, looking at the Resident Evil franchise, Resident Evil 7 was simultaneously a whole new RE game, but also sort of a pseudo-revamp of the series to bring it back to its roots. And yes, remakes of 2 and 3 started right after, but not for any real necessity to bring the franchise back. But again, more on that franchise next video. There's another option that I haven't talked about, and that is the idea of a remaster. In a surprise twist, a page could have been taken from the Nintendo handbook, with the recent remaster of Metroid Prime. It's the exact same game as the 2002 GameCube release, which is older than Dead Space I might add, but with a whole new polish for the HD gaming world. Same game, just updated graphics. Not unlike what 343 Industries did with the Halo Master Chief Collection and what Vicarious Visions did with the Crash Bandicoot series. These collections may have added a few minor things, but they're essentially the same game with an updated look. There's no need to completely remake it, because it is already as good as it needs to be. With Metroid Prime, I imagine this was done for the same reasons as Dead Space, revitalizing the franchise in anticipation of the long-awaited Metroid Prime 4, but in a lot easier and faster way in my opinion. Well, to wrap things up, I want to once again state that I appreciate all the hard work that Motive has done to make this remake. It truly is a fantastic product, and I don't want to disparage them in any way. I guess I just want to see this franchise expand so much that I'm just so anxious for a fourth entry into this franchise. That seeing so much effort put into something that I already love makes me a bit disappointed that it couldn't have been put into making something brand new. After all, there's already so many games out there, and there's just not enough time in the day to get around to them all already. Having two versions of something just makes it harder. I know it's a pretty lame thing to complain about, but still. Anyways, whether it's Dead Space 2, 3, or 4 next, I'm just glad the franchise is back, and here's hoping that the franchise is here to stay for a while. Thanks for watching or listening, and join me for next video as I break down yet another very similar remake that came out this year.